I'm Ryan Halford, and I love craniosacral therapy. From the theory, to the practice, to the people, there's always something in cranial work that fuels a sense of adventure in my life. I'd like to share that adventure with you on the Craniosacral Podcast. Hello, my craniosacral friends, and welcome to episode 14 of the Craniosacral Podcast. This will be a special episode today in a different format than we have experienced so far. I'm happy to tell you that today we will be going right into the classroom with M Shea and hearing about his current approach to working with head trauma. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking with Mike about a teaching engagement when he mentioned that he could use another TA at an upcoming head trauma class he was going to present at the Cortiva Institute in Scottsdale, Arizona. Now, to me, my dear listeners, this looked like a great opportunity to, surprise, put together a podcast for you. So I rearranged my clinical schedule and headed out to Arizona to sit in on the class. And Michael didn't know that I wanted to build an episode out of my visit until I sprang it on him the night before class started. And thankfully, Mike was totally cool with my idea and graciously allowed me to put a mic on him for 3 days and gave me permission to share whatever I wanted to with all of you. I thought this would be a good opportunity to give those of you who have not been in a class with Michael a taste for his teaching style, which I and many people in our field really respect and enjoy. And for those of you who have been in a class with Michael in the past but haven't seen him in a while, well, I thought this might be a chance for you to reconnect with his energy in a small way. I have spent the last week poring over a ton of audio in order to assemble a meaningful listening experience for you. And editing this episode was really difficult because there was so much rich material to sift through. But I've done my best to put together some of the more salient moments in class so that you might pick up some information about working with head trauma and also just soak up some of that yummy goodness that infuses our craniosacral classrooms all around the world. Now, in order to not make this episode 4 hours long, I had to leave out a lot of great stuff. But I did my best to cobble together some of the highlights, and I tried to give you a variety of clips. So we'll start off with the opening day meditation and then move on to various segments talking about principles of working with head trauma and the craniosacral system in general. I also included some lecture excursions into metabolic syndrome, which is a strong interest from Michael lately, and also saw a strong interest from class attendees who had a lot of questions about the topic. Now, I largely left out the hands-on portions of the training as they tend to be pretty experience-specific. I tried to focus on aspects of the class that would translate more easily to the podcast and to outside listeners. So I encourage you to consider settling into learning mode for this episode and maybe clear out some time to sit down and really absorb this material. You may even find yourself wanting to take some notes in a few areas. Another reason I'm so excited to present this episode to you is that in it we get to see Michael, one of the foremost educators in the field of biodynamic craniosacral therapy, talking about the more biomechanical aspects of the work. I was really surprised by the number of traditional techniques that Mike used as starting points for working with head trauma. I'm happy about this because social media has seen some really derisive discussions lately regarding tribal divisions in craniosacral therapy, in which some attempt to relegate biodynamic practitioners to the realm of disconnected ineffectiveness, while others try to relegate biomechanically oriented practitioners to the realm of overly simplified superficiality. In this class, I was really impressed to see Michael embrace some of the very traditional techniques which were developed in a mechanistic zeitgeist, acknowledging their usefulness, while also trying to bring the best parts of biodynamic understanding to their application. The boundaries of mechanistic and biodynamic work are really not so clear, my friends. We are all in this together, and at times I feel our tribal boundaries are largely unfounded and unproductive. Good work is good work, and it can be approached from multiple angles. So kudos to Michael for leading by example and bringing some breadth of application to his current teachings. So I hope you enjoyed this little sampler platter of Michael's class. I'll chime in at the end with a short summary of class material and a few additional words. Enjoy.
Thank you. We're going to be doing some cranial work, and so I want to be able to get you go through the posture with you for sitting doing this work, and then also a bit of a perceptual practice with you on this. So I'd like you just to take a few moments now to get settled in your chair as if you were about to do a session. Whether you're familiar with cranial work or not, it's done seated in an upright position, and your body doesn't really move a lot, and your hands don't really move a lot, but they're on the client. And what we'll do over these few mornings is some embodiment practice, embodiment practices. And I just want to say from the beginning here that the therapeutic intention of all the work that I teach, and consequently any of the hands-on work, that the intention for us as practitioners and the intention that I'm having, that I'm showing you with your client, is that they become embodied. That's the therapeutic intention here. The relief of from the side effects of concussions and so forth is the focus of this class, and the primary focus is embodiment. And so we can talk more about embodiment. And in concussions, frequently there's a tremendous sense of disembodiment, or not being able to feel the body at all. So we just reverse that equation and work towards embodiment. So let's take a few moments with our posture. So we'll go from the cognitive now into the practice. And we'll see if we can engage more of our body than our mind right now. And I think this being the first day, it's really valuable that you simply do a check-in with yourself right now. And that is, how are you feeling? How are you feeling in your body right now? For those of you that have had to travel, or for those of you that have had a very interesting morning getting out of your house. And how do you feel emotionally right now? We come into a classroom like this. Some of us are complete strangers to one another, and we all have a significant life that we've been carrying with us moment to moment, day by day, and then we walk into a classroom. So what part of your life, what part of the emotional dynamic of your life can you simply relax with at this moment so you can be more fully present? And how's your mind this morning? How are your thoughts? How are your thinking processes? What's up for you? What are you thinking about? What's dominating your mind? Also an interesting part of our life. So we're just doing a very short inventory of your body, your emotions, your mind, just to see where you're at right now. You don't have to change anything. You just simply have to be with it, or let it be. And in working with people that have had some type of mild traumatic brain injury, it's really valuable to do a body scan. So we're going to start with a body scan. Bringing your attention to your feet, getting a sense of whether or not your feet are relaxed. If there's a difference from your right foot to the left foot. And if you have connection with the ground. Can you simply let your feet and your legs rest in a way that you can feel more of the connection to the ground? And then getting a sense of your pelvis, the way the skin folds and wraps around your legs, folds and wraps around your pelvis, and getting a sense of balance from right to left on your pelvis, and then front to back. So just simply settling into your pelvis, finding the direction of the earth under your pelvis. So on this foundation, the trunk rests, your breathing might be coming into your awareness right now. Then you simply want to get a sense of how the breath has a complete cycle. It fills you and it empties you. So just get a sense of the feeling of the breath. You can think of the trunk of your body as a water balloon, and as your diaphragm and your lungs and your abdomen respond to breathing, just notice how this water balloon that fills the trunk of your body and your abdomen changes shape. Now, as we continue with this body scan, you may feel a very gentle sense of softening, relaxing, opening, and perhaps things becoming more still. Maybe your mind becomes more still, or you just feel more stillness in the space around us. So your senses are opening into more of a panoramic type of an awareness around us. So you can get a sense of how your shoulders and your arms are resting on top of the trunk of your body. And then getting a sense of your head and your neck. Want to make sure that your teeth and TMJ and mouth are soft, so you're not clenching your jaw. Your eyes can be open or closed, doesn't make any difference right now. So this is the first teaching to do a body scan with clients that have traumatic brain issues. And bringing your attention more fully now to your respiratory diaphragm. The sense of breathing, the sense of the water balloon shaping, reshaping itself. Getting a sense of the space just outside and off of your skin, around your body. And if you take a few moments to sense the movement of your heart is sitting on top of your respiratory diaphragm. So if you can take a moment to sense that, so bringing your awareness to that space above your diaphragm, between your lungs, between your sternum and your spine, is the heart, the pericardium. It's generating a very strong electromagnetic field. It generates heat. It moves blood. It's a very strong muscle, so all of these are movements that are occurring quite strongly right in the middle of the trunk of our body. So in what way are you able to sense the quality or quantity of that movement as the diaphragm moves up and down? And if you're not able to sense the movement of your heart as you sit there, then take your pulse at your radial artery and your wrist. So the starting point is a general sense of our whole body, the shape of our whole body, a sense of our breathing as a felt sense of a water balloon being displaced. And the movement of the heart. So this is our first embodiment practice as we prepare for the next 3 days together. So as we end, if you can bring your attention back to the movement of your diaphragm, just get a very general sense of your breathing. And then when you're ready, if your eyes are closed, if you can open your eyes. Maybe stretch your legs and feet a little bit. I can be trained. I'm just curious if you have any questions or comments on that practice. Well, there's enough people in here that don't know me, so I should say something about myself, right? Sure. Or I could ask Gail to introduce me.
One of my favorite people to sit and listen to. What can I say?
I'm on the cusp of semi-retirement, so this is kind of like my last full year of teaching. It doesn't mean I'm going to stop teaching. It just what that means is I'm going to travel to Europe less because I mainly teach in Europe. That's and so coming out here is just kind of like a lark. Coming to a massage school, it's which is my license to practice since 1975. I got out of the military and had a really strong case of PTSD. Which is probably compounded by prior concussions, you know, so when you really look at the history of your life and you see the history of your body, and in my case, seeing how it all fits in, and these basic relationships, and how then I end up at the age of 67 teaching a course on concussions. It took a long time to figure it out. But yeah, so a licensed massage therapist since 1975. Cranial work wasn't even invented then for practitioners other than osteopaths. So I went to the Rolf Institute in '79, and that's where formal trainings were being offered in cranial work, or actually it was cranial osteopathy. They'd have osteopaths come in and just teach a 2 or 3 day workshop. And that's really how it began becoming proliferated through our community. And this was in the pre-Upledger days. And the Rolf Institute asked John Upledger to speak at one of their annual meetings, and I was tasked with hosting him. I was the local Rolfer who had to take the guest speaker around and chauffeur him around. So I was hanging out with this, and he was kind of a wild guy. I mean, but I really liked him. I really liked him, and what he created, and what has now become an international institution, of which I'm involved in the international components of this at various levels of association and governmental regulations and so forth. I see all of it and how it's grown that way, and it's wonderful. And he was a major player, and he and I were born and raised in Detroit, so we really hit it off. So I was very appreciative of him, and he asked me to be in his first teacher training, and that was in the mid-'80s. So I took his first teacher training. It went on for about a year, and then was shocked that I even got a certificate. I actually took the certificate out of its frame last week, which was kind of awesome. You know, I had this, but it was in a closet for 10 years. And I decided to put a picture of the Dalai Lama inside the frame because it was a nice red color. I was like, oh, that's a perfect frame. And I don't need this certificate anymore. At least wise, I don't think I do. At any rate, what a wonderful profession and a wonderful career, because I had gotten an injury in my neck and I wasn't able to do Rolfing anymore. But the light touch cranial work was perfect. So I just threw my whole being into the cranial world at that time in the mid-'80s. And I really haven't looked back, except when my wife wants a Rolfing session. And she's the only one that gets Rolfing sessions. Don't tell anybody, I can still do that. So over that period of time, I've written 5 books on cranial work. I've got a book under contract right now with Handspring Publishing in England to contribute 8 chapters to a book that's collaborating on the dilemma of the contemporary client, looking at the biology of the contemporary client through the lens of metabolic syndrome and metabolic syndrome disorders, which is what the majority of our clients are dealing with in terms of their biology. So I'm collaborating, and it's my sister who's the expert on that. So we have this book under contract, and then I'm going to contribute all the chapters defining the evolution of cranial therapy and how to use that evolution of cranial therapy in contacting those clients that have metabolic syndromes or syndrome-related disorders and side effects, of which there are many, many. So I'm very active in writing and editing. I've got 2 chapters right now that are almost finished. But they're very academic, which means they have to have 50 to 100 references in them, so that's a lot of material to go through. But what I'm have created is called Compassion Connection for Pregnancy and Beyond, because my other world that I work in is the world of pediatrics, working with children with severe and significant brain damage, which is actually where the evolution of my hands-on style came from. So the beginning part of learning to work with concussions was we're learning to work with children and infants with severe, very severe brain injuries from birth, usually, or genetics. So I've got those 2 chapters that I'm working on with 2 separate authors, 2 separate publishers, and then also editing another book on breathing for another publisher. So I stay very busy in the academic world regarding our field. You know, what do we need to bring in, and what do we need to know about that's going to inform our hands, but also inform us about what's happening in the client when we get all of these strange responses and reactions and different movement patterns, and what is the contemporary client like. And that really is a significant piece, because the contemporary client is likely going to also have in the mix some history of a brain injury, whether it's depending on what you read, mild traumatic brain injury is the term du jour, MTBI or TBI, and we all know it as concussions. So, but that literature, of which Sari has been very, very helpful in forwarding a number of different pieces of literature, speaking to the relevance now of head injuries and the side effects of head injuries in children, in adolescents, and in adults. So we now have within the emerging literature a very comprehensive picture of head trauma at all ages. It's very, very significant. And I've tried to sum all that literature into one dynamic, which we'll talk about when we get to the overview, because we only have 3 days together. Step 1, principle number 1, that really needs to guide the whole process with the therapeutic engagement with the contemporary client. It's embodiment. We live in the age of disembodiment. We live in the age of fear. We live in the age of traumatic stress. I'm kind of tired of it because there's a whole other pre-existing condition that's available to us. And we have to be led to that pre-existing condition that's inherent, intrinsic within our biology, that's intrinsic within the cells of our body, is this foundation of health and well-being. And it's generally now called embodiment, and getting a sense of embodied wholeness. Leading the client, helping the client towards this embodied wholeness in which there's more meaning and order available at a conscious felt sense level. So embodied wholeness. Whatever we can do to help the client regain that sense of wholeness. And the very first thing we did when I was doing that practice is we did a body scan. You've got to start helping people with body scans. The more serious people you can do yoga nidra with. These are very, very long, extended body meditations that you can do with clients that are more seriously involved with PTSD and things like that, but in some way helping with the body scan. And the severity and seriousness of it can also be done in something you might consider just putting your table outside or doing some work with a client outside, because the field of nature now is becoming very important in the healing of PTSD. I'm seeing more and more of it in the literature with these Iraqi military veterans. So I like to tell the clients to spend time outside in nature, but most clients are overwhelmed and they can't do homework anyway because their lives are so full. So that first piece of embodied wholeness is what I come back to over and over and over again. I'm going to mix this up a little bit because I can do that. I want to state really the second biggest principle, which is number 4 right here. The second biggest principle that we're going to be working with therapeutically is the fact, and you've got the handout on it, and there are other pieces of literature on it, but when you have a brain injury, you've got compromised cerebral blood flow. So the focus of this class and the next class is going to be how can we increase cerebral blood flow? And to do that, you need to know how it gets up there, how it circulates, and what you can do to enhance that. There was also some literature, I'm sure those of you that are semi-addicted to Facebook and other social media, I'm not quite there yet, but I still use it. Is when that literature came out on the lymphatic system in the brain. Does anybody remember that literature that came out about 6 months ago? Okay. Well, if you look at that, I mean, in all the feeds that came through social media, you don't get really a lot of information on that. But when you actually look at the research article, you see that the discovery was based on looking at the arteries in the brain, the major arteries in the brain, because it's the lymphatic system that's going right along those major arteries. Why they never saw them before is a question that we'll never be able to answer, I don't think, after all these years. So we will also have a compromise in the lymphatic system, okay? And that so-called glymphatic system, which is one of the garbage removal systems of the brain. So part of having a brain injury is the backup of the garbage removal system, that glymphatic system. And what I mean by that is the proteins that are spent. When you look at literature like on Alzheimer's and dementia and things like that, the genetic coding for that has a lot to do with the protein structures in the brain, but also the ability to get the proteins and the used material out of the brain through this glymphatic system. So side effects, again, of this lack of circulation all the way down to the lymphatics, all the way down to the protein structure, takes you into a very, very big domain of cognitive impairment and different types of dementia and the whole evolution of Alzheimer's, all of which is increasing in our culture. Okay? And this isn't the only reason, but you and I are manual therapists, and this is what we can get our hands on. This is what we can evaluate. So one of the things I want to be able to do is be able to teach you how to evaluate cerebral blood flow. Not that you're going to be an expert in it by the end of 3 days, but it's a start. So, and we want to be able to get a sense of the cerebral blood flow, so we'll look at the anatomy of that. Now, the other thing that we need to be able to look at is how does the soft tissue and the osseous components of the cranium and neck, how are they responding to a brain injury? And a lot of that depends on the nature of the injury, whether it was in a car accident, a sporting event, or some other type of an accident to the head or neck. So traditional cranial work is really, really good in getting a sense of the mobility of the soft tissue and the fascias as well as the bones. So we're going to be visiting some of those hand positions, and you've got a big handout on the AO joint piece, because that's really a critical placement, hand placement. Osteopaths call that the gateway to the cranium. Does everybody have that AO joint space dynamic? That is in my myofascial text that just came out last year, but it's also, the handout you have is from volume 4 in my cranial text. I just copied and pasted that whole thing. And we're going to be going through that each day. We're going to work on the AO. So we've got an evaluation of the cerebral blood flow. We've got the more traditional evaluation of soft tissue and osseous movement or compromised movement as a result of head injury. And so that requires a new skill. I don't think we could call it a new skill, and I think as we get into it, I don't think it'll be that unfamiliar to you, but the skill, and you have a handout on it, is called bridging and blending. How do you bridge from a super light touch on an artery, and then your very next hand position, you're kind of engaging the tissue, and let's say you're in the AO, and then that finishes, and then you go to another hand placement that has a different degree of palpatory sensitivity. And that's called bridging, because we're looking at different systems. So for our purposes here, the bridging will be from the contact with the artery to the contact with the tissue and the movement of the bones, those three. So we're bridging back and forth. And that requires a different degree of sensitivity with your fingers, okay? You've got to be willing to put the brakes on and really back off, and then engage and then back off. So we're going to be working through that. The other piece that I want to say in terms of palpation, when I teach, I kind of divide the whole therapeutic piece into two parts. The first part is the palpation, obviously, but the second part is the perceptual process that we're going to be going through. Now, it's great because we've got some people that have no cranial experience and some people with oodles of cranial experience. And I want to say that the perceptual process that we're going to really be focused on is the therapeutic still point and stillness in general. When you have a concussion, things get very still. So there's a big activation of the endogenous opioid system in order to numb out the body from the potential damage to the brain, plus the numbing out that needs to happen so the brain itself can go through a repair cycle. And this is a pretty dramatic activation of the opioid system. One researcher talks about the dissociative cocoon, the generation and creation of a feeling of dissociation from a sense of reality of having a body, but also feeling like you're in this cocoon. And that's an indication of the opioid system being activated. So there's a denseness there, there's a kind of a fog, it can be a cognitive fog that people have as a result of brain injury. But if you look at the literature, the emerging literature about biology and metabolic syndromes, you see, I just saw it last week. If you've got high fructose corn syrup in your diet, you aren't thinking right. It goes right to your brain and causes confused thinking. That's been demonstrated now in the literature. So even the metabolic disruptions that occur from our diet are causing a great deal of confusion and cognitive dissonance. So something to consider. Although I think that study was in rats, so I just have to say that, because then I make it sound like when humans do it, but you have to be careful, you know, taking or extrapolating from rats to humans. They're so cute though, aren't they? Yeah, okay. Or not when they're in the house. I remember when I was younger, oh my God, when they get in the house, it's like, yeah, they're not so cute.
Well, they're cute, but not a good bunkmate.
Right, not a good bunkmate. Okay, great. The other perceptual process, you know, that we're working with here, I said stillness and still point, and the other one is slowness. So whatever we can do to slow things down, and that's going to be relevant even when we're working with that AO joint release. You know, any movements that we're inducing into the tissue have to be done slowly. They just have to be done slowly. All right, and there's really a good reason for that. But the other perceptual process I call the attunement cycle. And I've written about it a lot in some of my books, and now that I've aged a little bit, the process that I'm describing now, that you'll hear me when we're working on the tables, because I like to do guided processes on the table, and that is attention on yourself, attention on your own embodied wholeness. This is the key point in the neurological literature. You've got to be paying attention to your body 80% of the time when you're in the treatment room with a client. 80% of the time. Isn't that amazing? It's not a 50-50 deal. Now, 80% is arbitrary, because there'll be moments in the session where you're 100% focused on the client. There'll be moments in the session where you're 100% focused on what you're going to order at Amazon tonight when you get home, because you absolutely have to have the Dr. Bronner soap suds or whatever. The attunement cycle, you've got to put attention on yourself. And when you put attention on yourself, you got, if we could just categorize it, you got three things going on. You got your own embodiment process, so you want to be able to get a sense of your own body and keep that refreshed. Where are my feet right now? Where's my breath? Where's my heart? And I don't mean where's my heart romantically. I mean, can I feel the movement of my heart? All right? That's going to, and you'll see why that's critical as we go along in these 3 days. That's the component of self. And then there's a moment in which something happens in the client's body and your attention goes to your hands. And your attention goes to your hands in order to sense what's happening in the client. That's very natural. I usually just wait until I get a signal, and then all of a sudden my attention's in my hands. If you really look at it, you can play with that signaling between yourself, your body, your hands, and then the third element here, what's going on in space. I want to put my attention out into space, into the environment, into the natural world. As much as possible, because one of the key elements of biodynamic practice is biodynamic practice. When the model evolved about 20 years ago, the main teacher of the model, an osteopath by the name of Dr. Jellis, said that the natural world is now a part of the treatment. That was to me one of the more radical dynamics that could be expressed in therapy. So, as I said earlier, I mean, when I started a massage, people wanted their massage out in the backyard because I was practicing in Miami. So I did a lot of massages outside. you know. All those gated communities, all those fabulous swimming pools, you know. So, but now you're sitting inside your office, and how do you get into the natural world? Well, you do it through your ears. You're listening to the natural world. And visually, you can take yourself out the window to the natural world, out to the sky and the trees and so forth. So this is what's called the cycle of attunement. And attunement is a critical component, because the attunement process between a mother and a baby is what builds the autonomic nervous system and contributes to the development of the brain, depending on the attunement style you got. And there's different styles of attunement that parents have with children. So there's a tremendous amount of literature on this that's vitally important. And it's vitally important that you know that you should not and cannot actually, just in terms of the way perception works, you can't have your attention on the client for the solid hour that you're with them. It just doesn't work that way. We are constantly cycling our attention, all right? But it's a different percentage, perhaps. So you want to have a moment where you can let your attention go, and then you've got to spend a lot of time with your own body, and then finally the client. So I would say if there was a hierarchy, it'd be you and your body, the natural world, and then the client. You see, in other systems, it might be the client first, but here the client's last. I'm sorry. But that's a good thing. I'm sorry. They'll still pay you, honest. We've got an attunement cycle. It's very simple. It's natural. It's in the class here, it'll seem contrived because I'm going to ask you to deliberately move your attention, but then there'll be a point at which it becomes spontaneous. And you just want to be a very good observer of your own inner world. So we have this attunement, we have bridging and blending, we have a compromised blood flow, we have this compromise that extends into the soft tissue and osseous system. The main thing that we're going to be working with as a result of concussions is a loss of orienting and a loss of head righting. This is two major reflexes that go through this AO joint space in your body. So the orienting reflex is the ability to rotate your head so that it can orient to a novel stimulus in the environment. So we're constantly orienting to the environment anyway. But when you lose that ability and you get cut off from the natural world, your ability to orient to novel stimulus, it really ramps up aberrant physiology. It just ramps it up. It ramps up PTSD. It ramps up traumatic stress. And you get into a lot of defensive physiology. So Stephen Porges, how many of you are familiar with the work of Stephen Porges? Or heard of him? Okay, some of you. Stephen Porges, what a monster researcher. This guy has like published over 400 research reports. I mean, Porges. Porges, Stephen Porges, great guy. And he loves working with cranial people. And he's developed a theory about the social nervous system, it's called, and the autonomic nervous system. We can talk more about that, but not right now. What he talks about, because he loves cranial practitioners, is when you are with a client, the first job is to turn off defensive physiology in the client. That's the first thing you have to do. You have to establish a sense of safety. He calls it neuroception. Neuroception. You have to have a neuroceptive sense of safety in the environment before you can start moving into a healing mode in your body, from maintenance to healing. So the defensive physiology that we have to turn off in these traumatic stress circuits are all based on one thing, the establishment of safety, because the client's brain is in a mode where it's unconsciously feeling not safe. It's been injured. So it's endogenous. Whether that lack of safety is real or not, it's been injured. So you have to approach the client where there's a maximum sense of safety that you are radiating. Because according to this model and map that he's developed, which is also based on a lot of the infant attachment literature, is that that client is visually connecting with your face. It's all coming through face-to-face interactions. Thousands of research reports on this, these face-to-face interactions. So the client is looking at you and unconsciously gauging whether you're safe or not. How are you going to inhabit a body of safety? That's the key issue here. And that takes us back to the sense of embodied wholeness. Can you feel your feet on the ground? Are you comfortable with your breathing? Can you feel your breathing? And more importantly, can you feel the movement of your heart? If you can feel the movement of your heart, that person is going to feel a lot safer. A lot safer. All right, so that's whew, all right. Well, it took us right up to almost the break. Comments on that? I should stop talking. I mean, that's a lot of information. I mean, it's just a lot of data. But we're also trying to make sense of it. Yes? So there's many layers here of soft tissue. Remember, the idea here is that this is the gateway to the cranium. And I can tell you right now, this is the gateway to the vertebral artery. So the reason we're doing this ultimately is to increase blood flow to the brain, okay, and to get these reflexes rehabilitated. And to do that, we need to know the soft tissue because it has its own unique individual patterns of release. And so the first type of release I talked about was that simply one side will let go and the other won't, and you'll feel the head pull to the tight side and not to go into an unwinding process with that. I mentioned because of the shorter muscles that you have the opportunity that you'll get paradoxical motion, and that paradoxical motion tends to mimic the standard osteopathic discussion around a side bending type motion, a rotation type motion, and a flexion extension type motion, the sum of which is like a figure eight. So there's that possibility. Now, to cut to the chase in all of this as we go along, we are aiming to feel the vertebral artery, which is the deepest element of this joint space. We want to be able to feel that because then we know from that sensibility that there's blood flow happening and that the soft tissue is not restricting it anymore. That would be a nice thing, or we're assuming that. We're assuming that. Okay. The second thing that's going to be very important is, and this has to do with the very classic traditional craniosacral therapy, but also the biodynamic. This is where they merge, and that is the sense of the occiput going through a cycle of flexion extension in a slower tidal movement that we call primary respiration. So that motion, when you have your hands on the occiput, is a motion of flexion and extension. But it's got to be very slow. When you feel that slow motion of the occiput extending and flexing, and your fingers are sensing the vertebral artery, that's the end point of treatment. You're home. You're home. What's interesting about this, and again, you want to understand, these muscles right here the deep suboccipital muscles, are the ones whose fibers go through the occiput and insert on the dura. And this was a major piece of research that came out some years ago. You'd not heard of that? Okay. What was interesting is when you read the newspaper report on this, this was like 15, 20 years ago, and the researchers at like Johns Hopkins or the University of Maryland actually said in the newspaper article, we can now refer people with these type of tension headaches that have this pattern from this musculature to massage therapists rather than surgery to sever the muscles, which was the surgery du jour for those tight muscles when you had chronic tension headaches. We can now refer to, but the point here, it's beautiful actually, because you can feel the softening, and all of a sudden you're in those deep muscles. Once you're in those deep muscles, you're in the dura. You are actually on the covering of the brain. Because of the sensitivity with our fingers, that sensibility is that now you've entered into the cranium, which is why you have to be really, really slow and cautious with this. Because you want then for that occiput to inhabit its flexion and extension motion in the long tide, and being able to feel the vertebral artery. And this is such an elegant technique. Technically, I consider everything on the other side of my skin the natural world, right? So these chairs and all this is the natural world, although it's been refined a lot and cooked and baked and has a price tag on it, all the way to the sky. So everything between my skin and the sky is the natural world. Obviously, the natural world being more related to the elements of air, earth, fire, and water, in the natural world, including animals as well. So that would be more of the preference in terms of connecting with the natural world. But on the one hand, once I'm outside here, then all of this is the natural world. Who was it was there somebody in my New York City class when I did that training? We were trying to figure out how to deal with the natural world, because I did a foundation training in New York City. Now, the classroom, now this, even though we're on a street right here, it's kind of relatively quiet, except when the sirens come by. In New York, it's constant. It's just the horns are blowing, the windows had to be open, the sirens, it's just unbelievable, the noise. So we developed this whole visualization where we were out on the African savannah. And what we were actually hearing were just wild animals coming by. And when those sirens happened, and when that garbage truck came by every 3 days to empty out all the waste from the building next door, and it was 90 minutes of a garbage truck. 90 minutes of this garbage truck. That was just like the wildest animal fight you could have on the African savannah. Yeah, it's tough. But no, you really, if you think about it, just everything out here is the natural world. So you've got to have a very active fantasy life, to make it through. And if you happen to live in Steamboat Springs, you've got more access to the natural world. So. Whenever you have that type of exaggerated motion, you have to understand that there's you saw the Atlas thing, and we talked yesterday that there's 3 or 4 schools around the globe that focus on the Atlas. There's also 3 or 4, possibly more schools that focus on the type of stretch that would release the dura. And having received these techniques myself, they involve a fascial stretch where you exaggerate, to the right or to the left, and you're holding the head in a certain way until you put enough tension on the dura that it then softens, within that context. So frequently, that means, these discoveries means that there's something normal about that. There's something intrinsic, it can do it itself. So if you're there and all of a sudden the head goes way off to the right, if you can just slow it down, let it be there. It's likely that the dura is releasing at that point. That's all I can tell you based on my experience with that. And so then once it releases, you'll feel some softening, or you can just continue the treatment right there, because somebody may need to stay there for a while. So I just shift my chair, because I have one of those little roller things, and just shift and get angled correctly so that I can input to a head that's side bent or rotated.
Couldn't one also find ease in that position?
Yep.
Yeah.
The thing around that theoretically is that there was a large focus, and any Rolfer knows this, on an orientation of the tissue around a midline. And what's happened is, in the past 15 years, is that the midline has been dismissed as a reality within embryological development. So that's really thrown the osteopathic world into a whole, well, it started in Britain, and so we would say it's into a kerfuffle. And so when you aren't operating from a midline, then you have to find another operating principle to work with, and it's the principle of wholeness, connecting with the whole. Because that's the original embryological principle before the theory around the orientation of growth and development to a structural midline, even a non-structural midline. Now, that being said, and having put my foot in that argument and gotten a lot of blowback from people that don't want to let go of the midline, yes, there are functional midlines, and midlines but they're temporary. That's the issue around midlines. If you look at embryological development, yes, we form around a certain axis. Yeah, but that might last an hour for that phase of development. And then that midline, whether it's structural or functional, is going to disintegrate because there's expansive growth of the whole. And so the whole is the organizing principle, not the midline in the shift here. That's why we focus those very simple meditations of body scans, feeling the heart field, feeling the heart itself puts you into a holistic sense of the body. So anything like that gives you that sense of holism. And if you run into a midline, it's only temporary. So that's why in the early days there was the thought, well, if the head goes off to here, take the head and put it back on its midline axis. No, you don't do that now. You let the head be there. Okay. Now, if they get up off the table and they're walking out the door like this, say, hey, come back. You know, that is when it gets down to it, that's the biggest question that I get feedback on, you know, when I'm in some classes, to do or not to do. That is the biodynamic question, really. And what I have found in teaching this for more years than I can imagine is that it really is stylistic. It's really up to you as the practitioner. If you want to explore a non-doing system of therapy, this is the perfect vehicle to explore that. You can sit there, come into relationship, and do cycles of attunement ad infinitum, and just synchronize your attention with the tide and stillness, and let it unfold. That is a perfectly valid way. And then there's doers. And I was raised as a doer.
Yeah, me too. That's why this is kind of like, wow.
Right. I think it was because my mother drank Dewar's scotch. And it was bad? Yeah, that was bad. Okay. Right. Well, she prided herself. She even told me this towards the end of her life, you know. I had 2 drinks of scotch every night when I was pregnant with you, and on the weekends I had 3.
Yay!
Coupled with a pack of cigarettes today, and I looked at her and I said, Mom, you were a party animal. That's what we call a party animal. And she got really upset I called her that. At any rate, so the doing, the not doing, is I find that I do a combination. That sometimes I get into a session and it's a decision. Does this time call for non-doing? Where I just come into relationship? Or does this session call for some doing? Because most of us in here have learned 1,000 doing things. And you don't really want to give that up. It's just the issue that I talk about, because there's so much misunderstanding about this one issue in the cranial world. It's a question of sequencing. It's just sequencing. Like the issue around mechanical work. This is technically, you're learning mechanical work for the last day and a half, and we're going to continue that, but within a context that's biodynamic. In other words, it lends itself to a very rapid bridging into the texture of slowness and stillness. So that's a very important key point with the whole process, especially the bridging component. I forgot what I was going to say. What was I going to say?
Something about sequencing. And that was the issue of the...
Yeah, so you can do the mechanical work. You can do any work you want. And I say, do it in the middle of a session. If you're going to do exploratory, doing-oriented work. But as best you can, start off slowly, with a non-doing and end up with the non-doing. It's just going to it'll give the client more time to integrate the pieces that you've added to their system that they're going to have to negotiate.
You're doing this.
You're doing this. It's just sequencing.
Doing from a non-doing perspective, still keeping the non-doing aspect of
Right.
and doing.
Correct.
So it's a kind of a blend. You're not doing and not doing, but there's a doing from a place of
Right.
space.
Yeah, and that's why I gave you that handout on bridging and blending. Bridging and blending applies at every single level, because the evolution of manual therapy over the last 40 or 50 years has just included more methods, more systems, more styles. So we ought to be, with experience, be able to then bridge and blend. Because anytime you take, all of you that have been in continuing ed, you take what you get from the continuing ed and you've got it integrated within days or weeks in your clinical practice. And then you're just doing you. You're not doing a clone of the teacher or anything else. And you should be doing you, actually. Okay. But that's a really good point. Non-doing, doing from the non-doing point of view. Thank you, Tom. So the work this afternoon, the first piece is on getting a relationship with this occipital mastoid suture right here. So the first thing we're going to have to do is to palpate that area. And the beauty of it is that this occipital mastoid suture, if you can see, it looks like it's in a valley here. And there is a concavity. So your fingers, as you palpate, will slide right into a concave space in back of the ear. So if you put your fingers right directly in back of the ear, and then you just slide back, you'll go down a ridge, and that ridge is the occipital mastoid suture.
It's nice when things are so obvious.
Pardon?
Is that the temporal bone?
Yep.
So the ridge is on the temporal bone.
Yep. It's near the mastoid suture, so it's called the mastoid, occipital mastoid suture, but it's the one half of it is the temporal bone, the other half is the occiput. it's a beveled suture, so it's angled. It's a kind of got like a sliding edge to it. Now, why did I choose this suture? I mean, there's so many sutures in the cranium that you could work with. The original notion coming through osteopathy, and especially the way Roland Becker talked about it, is that this particular suture is the primary stress suture in the entire system. If you can unlock this suture, then you can unlock the entire sutural system of the cranium. And the reason he said that is that because in osteopathy, the occiput itself is considered to be the primary stress bone of the cranium. Why in osteopathy do they call so we have to back our way into it and then come forward again. So why would they call the occiput the primary stress bone of the cranium? It's because of the birth process. In typical vaginal deliveries, the baby presents two different ways, and this is very general, with one side of the occiput, of his or her occiput, or the other side presenting into the birth canal. That's the way you enter the birth canals, with the occiput. It's called LOA or ROA, left occiput anterior, right occiput anterior. And this will be in 60 to 70% of vaginal births. You'll have that initiating point of the infant's cranium leading with that part of the occiput. So, and again, this is just in the majority, it's a generalization, but so you've got the occiput presenting, and then you have, and I was just reading about this again last night, you have about 100 psi. The pressures on the cranium during birthing are quite amazing. And all the bones of the cranium are what are called composite bones at birth. So you don't have one occiput. You've got 4 separate bones that are connected by membrane. The frontal bone is 2 bones. The temporal bone is 3 bones. And the sphenoid is 3 bones. So you've got a cranium during the 3rd trimester in fetal development that's actually a composite that is not fully ossified yet. And that entire ossification process doesn't take place for another 6 years after birth. So that level of flexibility is necessary in order to navigate the birth canal. And it turns out, in terms of just the mechanics of the birth, that the majority of pressure that comes through the cranium is fed back to the occiput. This is what the osteopaths have figured out. And how'd they figure that out? Since about the 1920s, up until I think probably the early 1960s, the United States had osteopathic hospitals. And almost every baby that was born in every hospital for 50 years was given a cranial osteopathic exam.
Wow.
That living body of knowledge has been completely lost. Completely lost. Gone. Not written about, discussed somewhat in literature. So you have to find through different osteopathic writings you're a doctor, you're delivering the baby, but then you do an exam on it. You're not making soap notes on that exam because it's second nature. So it just becomes ingrained in the culture, the knowing of an infant's cranium and an infant's body. And then when it's not written about and not taught, then it goes out. But it's been reconstructed in a number of different ways. So I'm distilling that information and applying it here so that you can understand that if you were born, then you've got stress and strain in your occiput. Since all of us were born, there's stress and strain in the occiput. Now, I know the first question then is, well, what about a C-section? Obviously, that's not going to manifest particularly what happens in a C-section is those pressures go to the lungs. And you get the most prevalent side effect of a C-section is lung problems, asthma problems, because you need the compression in the lungs to force out the fluids. And that didn't happen in a C-section. So the vector of stress goes from the cranium to the lungs. And if it goes to the lungs, that means that the vector of stress in a C-section is going to inhabit the cardiovascular system and heart, because those feedback loops between the lungs and the heart and the diaphragm are all off. Now, you know, it's just totally amazing how adaptive we are. I know there was a documentary a year or two ago on how human beings can live in every single climate on the planet Earth. It's just amazing.
And they adapt.
And they adapt.
In South America, their lungs are bigger.
Right.
Want
Exactly.
oxygen.
Right. So that means if you have a C-section, remember the occiput was designed to take the stress, so it's still the primary stress bone. Okay? And typically in a birth, because of the way births happen, in a vaginal birth, you get fixations in the occipital mastoid suture. So one of the big leftover pieces of the lost 50 years of probably 1 million cranial exams of newborn babies, it's really stunning. And so you're getting, you know, bits and pieces of that here, in that it's, and Becker said it, this occipital mastoid suture is the go-to suture that you need to free up if someone is expressing challenges that are neurological in origin or from a closed head injury or whatever the symptoms might be. This is a suture that you need to evaluate. So how are we going to evaluate the movement across and through that suture? The first way it's done in osteopathy and cranial osteopathy is with what's called V-spread technique. So how many of you have heard of that? Familiar with that? How many of you practice that? I practice that. I had to teach it, but I rarely practiced it, and it's been revisioned just in the last 3 years in osteopathy. V-spread technique is where you feel a strain pattern. So we're going to palpate each other's occipital mastoid suture and feel which one to us is has the most density in terms of tissue. That's one way you can feel where one side is bogged down than another. And then what you do is you place the suture between two fingers on the side that feels fixated. And then you take one finger and you place it on the other suture, and you just hold it like that. And you imagine a beam of light between your finger going through the V, like that. That's the way it's done in osteopathy. It used to be in the old method where you had to point the finger, and now they're saying that's not necessary. So we can have a more gentle connection with one finger on one side and then two fingers on the other side. That's the first thing that we're going to do.
What did you say that's called again?
V spread technique, because the fingers are spread. V spread technique. That took me a while to figure out. What is the spread?
I never got the spread.
Yeah. Yeah, I never got it either, and in the last couple of years, and when I heard that lecture from the Cranial Academy, I went, oh, okay, let me revisit this, you know, because it's unobtrusive, and let me just see what's going on here. So, occiput, primary stress bone in the cranium. If you get a concussion, the occiput's going to absorb the majority of the impact because it's designed for that. Even if the impact came through the frontal bone or the side, wherever it comes through. That's the point. And concussions happen from all different angles, including the face. So, and we have to work with the face in the next module, you know, because you got to get a sense of how to manage a concussive force that's come through the face. So, primary stress bone, even in concussions, and so secondly, the mobility of the occipital mastoid suture is then compromised. And the reason that that's important is because of the occipital mastoid suture relationship to the brainstem and the cranial nerves. There seems to be a tremendous amount of reflex activity. According to some osteopaths, you're not going to see this in a book, reflex activity between the occipital mastoid suture and the brainstem, and consequently the majority of the cranial nerves. So it seems that that suture has an impact on the cranial nerves in general and the function of the cranial nerves. So, primary stress bone, primary sutural restriction area, and in traditional osteopathy, the reason you'd then want to free that fixation is that it would free the flow of cerebrospinal fluid through the fourth ventricle. That's very, very traditional thinking. Okay.
Free, say that again?
It would free the movement of cerebrospinal fluid through the fourth ventricle, which is directly anterior to the occiput. So when you study traditional osteopathy, and when you study, if you were to take like an Upledger 1 course, or and not just necessarily Upledger, but typically in most courses you learn about the ventricles and the cerebrospinal fluid, and you learn how to impact and improve the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, which is going to improve function of the nervous system. And you do that through, particularly through techniques associated with the occiput and the temporal bone. That's the way in which cerebrospinal fluid is managed in traditional cranial osteopathic concepts and in craniosacral therapy in general.
Well, this explains so much on my experience with the occiput. It's like all these things kind of hooked up.
Right. Yeah.
So people are having restrictions with that. This is the concussion symptoms. They're having the same symptoms as that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this first level, then, we've got to be able to evaluate the occiput because of these fundamental relationships that have been discovered functionally between cerebrospinal fluid, you know, between the function of the cranial nerves and so forth, and between the brainstem. And we started with the orienting reflex. Let's start getting the reflex activity better. Now let's go to the next level with the occiput and evaluate the occiput. And we're going to start with trying to get freedom across the suture line, and then we'll do a traditional CV4. And I'll show you a wonderful way, well, I'll show you the way I teach it to do that. But I first want you to get we're going to palpate the suture. Ryan is going to make a podcast out of this. So I'm sure he's going to take these selected clips, you know, about telling dirty jokes to my hand, and it'll all be on the internet really soon. Until she peed her pants.
Your aunt is no longer alive, is that true?
That was true, but my wife goes commando, and she's been going commando since I met her, so there's no sense buying her underwear. She'd never wear it, which is what I found out after my one trip to Victoria.
That's important. That'll definitely be in the podcast, and your wife is going to really like you.
Should I just keep going?
Fuel to the fire.
What'd you learn in your class?
Well, Mike's wife doesn't wear underwear.
Jay's wife is a little bit racy.
Yeah, you're gonna pay for that one.
What does it say about
Yeah. Oh, okay. I don't know why I took my watch off, but yeah, it's the next step. Okay. settle. So, there's a question about the nutritional component. Let me take a couple of minutes with that because I think it's really important, because that's a major seismic shift in our culture that's happening right now in terms of, it's the orientation is around diet and nutrition, but the orientation is what's happening metabolically in our biological systems these days. And so we have what are called metabolic syndromes, or MS, metabolic syndrome in general. And apparently, as of like 2 years ago, it was like 50, as I said, 51% of the world's population in developing countries has metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is associated with probably over 100 disorders and diseases right now. Wow. The main ones being obesity, diabetes, and almost all forms of cardiovascular disease. And 70 to 80% of people have some type of cardiovascular challenge going on. 50% of all birth defects are birth defects of the cardiovascular system. So the metabolic system of the body, the way in which molecules are transported from the food we eat and the nutrition we eat, and how they cross borders and boundaries, is the definition of metabolism. The notion of anaerobic and all of that is an older definition of metabolism, but now metabolism is how are the molecules going across epithelial and endothelial linings in the body. And as I said the other day, the size of these molecules depends on the opening that's allowed in the endothelium and epithelium. And that size then determines whether the immune system gets alerted or not. Fat molecules are way too big. Sugar molecules of refined sugar are the primary problem, are way too big. Fructose in general, especially coming from corn, is a molecule that has no genetic coding in the human body to process, to know about. The human body does not know what to do with most forms of refined sugar, but especially high fructose corn syrup, invert syrup, all that kind of stuff. So those molecules then are misshapen, missized, generally too large, and so they kind of force their way through the endothelium of the gut, which then alerts the immune system, because 80% of your immune system is in your gut. So your immune system goes on red alert, and what's the first thing an immune system does when it senses a threat? It goes into an inflammatory process. Why does it go into an inflammatory process? To generate a whole bunch of other molecules and chemicals to alert the system to create healing, and to alert us that something's wrong that needs to be fixed and needs to be changed. The problem is when you have a chronic activation of the immune system, and this is really well documented in the literature, it's really hard to turn off the inflammatory process. Very, very hard. This is why you have chronic pain in some people. This is why you can work your buns off doing manual therapy, and the client keeps coming back with the same symptoms, same symptoms, same symptoms. They get temporary relief, but they come back with the same symptoms. So it means that their gut is on fire. For me, the clients, especially a bunch of clients I saw last week or the week before, it's just totally amazing. The first principle in all of this is put the fire out. You got to put the fire out. You've got to put the fire out of these inflammatory processes. And so that's a very difficult change to make for people, because if it usually will involve a dietary change and a reduction in sugar, reduction in gluten, a reduction in dairy, and a reduction in soy. Those are the four major pieces.
Can you say that again? Sugar?
a reduction in sugar, a reduction in gluten, a reduction in dairy, and a reduction in soy. When you take a child with cerebral palsy or a child with some anomaly that they're dealing with that's been chronic, and you just start reducing those four out of their diet, bingo, you get across the board an improvement in every single child. I've seen it in every single child when they get that level of metabolic testing.
How long does that typically take to change?
At this point, in terms of what's being discussed in the literature, the gut lining is so damaged, we're talking about years. I am so sorry to deliver this information on the last day on a Sunday, but this takes years. It's a lifestyle change. The repair that has to happen in the gut has to happen at a number of different levels. And the beauty of it is there are programs now in terms of that repair that are quite helpful. And that also includes the whole nature of probiotics and that industry.
That can expedite the healing.
That can expedite. Well, that's an essential part of the component. Fermented foods and probiotics in terms of the rebuilding process.
I've heard just different conflicts on the probiotics. If you're healthy, you don't need to do probiotics every day. Some people say you should take them every day. It's not going to hurt, right?
No, it doesn't hurt. Here's the issue with all that, because there's 1,000 diet books out there, and there's all this, that, and the other thing. You've got to get metabolic testing. People just willy-nilly, you might listen to a lecture like this, and one of you might end up in a health food store on the way home and grab your 30 billion probiotic. But the metabolic testing is a stool sample, and it's a stool kit. And that's where you find out exactly what is going on in your gut, because all of the inflammatory markers will be there and can be measured, and you get an exact printout. A medical doctor reads it and then gives you the information and makes suggestions on how to change and what the severity of the issue is. So, second principle. First principle is put the fire out. The second principle is once one endothelium is inflamed, all endothelium in the body are inflamed. What does that mean? It means the cardiovascular system is in deep trouble, because the endothelium of the arterial system and the arteries in your brain and everywhere else in your body are going through an inflammatory process. They're having to process this. That's how these molecules are getting from the gut to the liver, and the liver says, I don't know what to do with these. So the liver converts them to fat cells and converts them to visceral fat that then cover your organs, and then you balloon out from there. Once you get that a level of conversion from the liver, then the cells are no longer able to produce insulin in general. And so then you become insulin dependent, because every cell has an insulin factor. Once that happens, then leptin is also compromised, and leptin is the neurochemical in cells that tell you when you're hungry and when you're not hungry. But basically, that system short circuits, so you're constantly eating because you don't have an on and off button. Okay, all of which is rooted in prenatal development. All of this is set up during pregnancy when you were pregnant.
Is that because of what the mother is eating?
That's only partially accurate. The thing is, in pregnancy, it's not just about the diet, although that's important. It's about mother's stress levels in general.
Sure. Okay.
So those stress levels then influence the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, epinephrine, and what's the other one? Cortisol. So when those levels go up in the mother's bloodstream, those levels go up in the placenta. When those levels go up in the placenta becomes inflamed. There's an inflammatory process that's initiated. When the placenta becomes inflamed and goes through this, it's called oxidative stress. That's a fancy word for inflammation. What happens then is that the epigenetic switching mechanisms that are happening 1 trillion times during prenatal development to make sure you get the toe where you need it and everything needs to get where it's going, the epigenetic switching is compromised. And in epigenetics is really simple. It really is. There's a sleeve around the DNA, okay? And it's the sleeve around the DNA that's signaling to the DNA to replicate, okay? But it happens in zones. So if you're in a critical phase of development, let's say your hippocampus needs to develop now, or the tail of your pancreas needs to develop now, there's going to be a zone on your DNA that needs to be switched on. And in that zone, however, there are 2 areas. There's the area of the maternal genes, and then there's the area of the paternal genes. Okay? In epigenetic switching, it means the wrong gender, and not meaning in terms of it's going to interfere with your gender, but the wrong set of genes. The mother, let's say the tail of the, I'm making this up right now. Let's say the tail of the pancreas requires genes from the mother's side of the equation in that zone. But because of maternal stress, these elevations of cortisol and all that, and the inflammation in the placenta, the paternal gene is what is turned on within that zone, the wrong gene, okay? And so if that happens repetitively over time, then it sets up a chronic potential for disease process later in life. So 30 or 40 years ago, it was recognized, oh my gosh, cardiovascular disease didn't start to manifest in a lot of people till they were in their 40s and 50s. But it started in this epigenetic switching in prenatal development. Why did it wait 40 years? So all of these things, like obesity, that now they've discovered that starts in prenatal development. So all these things are going back to that period because of this epigenetic switching. So we have to really also appreciate the irony of the situation. There's no way you can avoid stress as a mother or a family system. You know, there's no perfect pregnancy or anything like that. So it's back to that same thing we talked about the other day. It's never too late to get the love you need, number one, to repair what it is that needs to be repaired. But it makes it unique in terms of how your life unfolds biologically. As they say, sprout where you are planted.
The cardiovascular disease in Asia is very low, and their diet doesn't include really most of those things.
Pardon?
Their diet is, they don't do a lot of sugar, a lot of dairy, a lot of gluten. It's mostly rice.
Well, I'm not so sure about that in terms of the literature, because they're bending over backwards in the Far East to catch up with us, especially in China. Catch up with us, to catch up with the developing world so that more stuff can be marketed to make sure they're a patient for life. That's what the doctors in Europe say. If it starts in childhood, then you're a patient for life, if you start taking medications and all that. But at any rate, that's changing, just to say that is changing. Because these figures, these epidemiology figures on metabolic syndrome, it's worldwide. It includes China, it includes Malaysia, it includes India. Of course, India has had a fixation on sugar forever. So that is changing in terms of the epidemiology.
So I'm gathering that part of the importance and value of studying blood, or arteries and veins and that whole thing, is that it's not just that stuff that comes out when we cut ourselves or, travels our nutrition around our bodies. It also carries this inflammation. I think what you said is that if it's inflamed in one place, the blood touches that place and it goes everywhere?
Yep.
Is that basically it?
Yep.
Wow, okay.
You have a circulating inflammatory condition. The beauty of the blood is that the blood carries the antidote with the poison.
Okay, love that.
The erythrocyte, which is 84% of our human cells are erythrocytes. Can you imagine that? The majority of what makes us human is our blood, our red blood cells. And the basic problem, and I was going to show some slides on this, so this is kind of on purpose, really. Concussions, diet, huh? But if we really, let me talk about the endothelium in a minute, but let me just go to solution right now. The chronic problems that people have, let's say from concussions and trauma and things like that, you're dealing with very complex neurophysiology and psychophysiology because of the aberrant nature of what's happening in the autonomic nervous system. What's happening now because of metabolic syndrome is the substrate underneath those physiological responses that we used to be really good at kind of stabilizing and helping, and now they're becoming more chronic because the metabolism underneath is compromised. It's going to be really hard to cure trauma, even like a motor vehicle accident, unless if that person comes in, they just had a car accident and they're obese, you've got a problem on your hands. You've got a big problem on your hands. It's going to take a lot longer, and you might end up with multiple different symptoms that are occurring other than, let's say, the obesity. And obesity isn't the only one. 20% of skinny people have metabolic syndrome. So when the skinny ones come in, you go, you just don't know. But you know in terms of how they are presenting on the intake and the symptoms. So the endothelium of the arterial system in the capillary, in the arteries, and throughout the body, and especially the brain, the endothelium, and in the inner lining of the heart is an endothelial lining. The endothelium of the cardiovascular system is a layer that's a single cell thickness. It's a single celled thickness. In other words, it's a veil. It's this gorgeous thin lining on the very inside of the heart and in the arterial system. The cells that comprise the endothelium, this is the where we link it to the cranial piece that we're doing. Those cells, that single layer of cells, has a particular shape and structure, and they're now known to be what are called quiescent cells. They have very, very low metabolic activity. That's why a lot of the research talks about shear stress in the arterial system of the blood coming through and the blood rushing along that lining. And they've realized that that's also a zone of quietness. And that between the movement of the blood and the quietness of the endothelium, there's an induction of growth for that arterial system in general. But the quiescent cells, here's what happens. So that means there's biological stillness. That's what I call it, biological stillness. Throughout the inside of the heart and the inside of the arteries. That endothelial lining of quiescent cells, okay, changes shape in an inflammatory process. And they lose their quiescence. They speed up. Their dynamic metabolic activity at a cellular level changes and becomes faster. When they change shape, it allows different sized molecules to go through, and you're off and running in immune system activation, arterial sclerosis, the buildup of plaque, all of that kind of stuff.
Any books that you suggest reading on all of this information?
You know, there are a lot of books. My sister is reviewing all of them, and we're going to publish it in that one book I was telling you about on metabolic syndrome. And then the cardiovascular work that I teach is one possible antidote. But I want to tell you if you really want to get some really good information on this, you want to you can buy it, but it's a lot easier to look at it on YouTube. It's actually not on YouTube. Robert Lustig, and it's called Lustig Fructose 2.0. Lustig. Lustig. That's his name. He's a pediatric neuroendocrinologist teaching in the medical school at the University of California, San Francisco. Lustig fructose 2.0. It's a lecture he gave a year and a half ago at the medical school on exactly what I just talked about.
YouTube? Is it YouTube?
No, you got to Google that because it'll take you to the University of California, San Francisco television channel.
Okay.
And then from there, you'll click on his piece. Now, the other thing that they've done at the University of California, San Francisco, they have done a beautiful series of short 3 to 4 minute videos called The Skinny on Obesity. And each one of these, 3 or 4, they interview like the top researchers and the top educators, and they give you the data. They give the information on metabolic syndrome. So that's a long answer, but I wanted to get into the endothelial issue because we've got some slides we're going to look at in terms of the endothelium, and you'll see that key piece. And so remember yesterday and the day before when I was saying while we're working, notice the stillness and place more of your attention in the stillness? That is the curative healing response that you're looking for in terms of the lowering of the inflammatory response, the relaxation of the endothelium in general, and the renormalization of the immune system is based on that stillness. So in working with concussions is very important because that concussive dynamic has a stillness aspect to it. But when we're working with the carotid sinus or any of the cardiovascular pieces like in the next course, then the stillness becomes more relevant, more and more relevant, that we just align with that possibility consciously. So I just put out a lot of information, a lot of cognitive information from different streams. I tried to link it together so that you have a sense that when you're dealing with a client with a head injury, that there can possibly be deeper metabolic issues that might have to be approached. Touching into the cardiovascular system, as we've done with the carotid sinus, is valuable. Feeling your own heart is extremely valuable because that has so many different things that it can do for you, especially in terms of changing brain structure. So, and the sensibility around stillness. So the stillness piece, the movement of your own heart, the contact with the radial artery and the contact with the carotid sinus, all of which begin to interface with the metabolic system. When you're on an artery, you're in the metabolic system. You can't get any deeper than that with manual therapy that I know of. The blood carries it all, carries everything. Every single piece of building material that needs to happen to keep this body going and beyond. And all the metaphysics of the blood that you read about in different sources and in traditional Chinese medicine. So,
Just any clarification. I should know this, but the cardiovascular system, we've mostly been talking about arteries
Yep.
in the heart.
yep.
Are veins part of that? Or are they a different system? I'm assuming that they're the same, but
No, they're part of the system.
yeah. Do they
But
still have that fine line of flow along their edges, or is that a different thing?
Well, the flow in a vein is dependent upon the flow in the adjacent artery to help it along, number one. The veins are considered ponds and pockets of fluid that has tidal movement in it. So veins are considered more from a biodynamic point of view to be areas of stillness, zones of stillness, because of the very different quality of movement and the slower movement that occurs within them. And metabolically, the veins are more closely associated with the thermoregulatory system. So it's the veins that are kind of like the radiator in your car. They're the cooling system.
So if something's cold all the time or hot all the time.
Right.
What's
Well, the arteries are the heating system, and the veins are the cooling system. And I live in the tropics, and anybody that works out at a gym and you look at your arms or your legs at the end of a workout and you see your veins are popping out, that's because they're cooling. They come closer to the surface, and the walls of the veins are thinner. So the heart increases circulation so that there can be more cooling of the blood going through the veins. So that's a very intimate part of the thermal regulatory system in terms of the venous system. I get a lot of flack from osteopaths in Europe about this, but that's okay.
About what in particular?
Well,
The veins or the cooling system?
in osteopathy in general, boy, are we, no, we're on purpose, no. In osteopathy in general, there is now a return, a really beautiful revival of the work of Andrew Taylor Still. There's biographies now that are being published about him. There's his early works are being republished. And he was the one that set up the basic principles of osteopathy in general, in which a fundamental principle, as stated, is that the rule of the artery is supreme. Now go research that, because that gives you some very interesting information from a Civil War physician. So we're talking about information, but beautiful information, because he had a mystical experience. That's why he got out of being a physician and into an osteopath. You know, he had this metaphysical conversion experience, and it turns out many osteopaths have these types of experiences, like Still. That's a little known.
Near-death kind of thing? Is that
No,
correct?
no, not a near death, but more of an epiphany. What would James call it? A conversion experience. You know, where you just all of a sudden you're filled with the light of the divine, and
Okay.
you're. Whoop! I think I'm going to go this way. You know, you make a U-turn into the future. So at any rate, that revival includes an understanding of the rule of the artery, and there's very few osteopaths worldwide that are even teaching the arterial work. There's like one in Australia. There's one or two people here in the United States. I've listened to their work. Very mechanical, very valuable. The French osteopaths teach it, but they argue that Still meant also, or to include, the rule of the vein. But when you really look at contemporary information and research on the veins versus the arteries and what's going on, and what, in one interpretation, was Still meant by the rule of the artery, the veins still, are important in the sense of the perceptual process, but not as important as, and this is my opinion, in terms of therapeutic hands-on work. Very difficult to get your hands. You can get your hands on superficial veins, but when we were contacting the carotid sinus, yeah, the vein was right next to it. How can you tell you're on? Because you probably were also sensing the vein, but the power of the artery is what you're sensing here. So how do you know you're on a vein? It's because you begin to feel zones of stillness and quietness around the artery. Your palpation skills around the artery begin to expand, or you sense this pervasive panoramic stillness around you, which is really a prenatal dynamic. And then you know you're in the venous system. And you know that not so much through your palpation, but through the perception of stillness. Okay? In the veins. It emerged, or it surfaced in the osteopathic literature about 20 years ago, in which there was a decrease in focus on doing a CV4, because that was the mainstay of cranial practice for so many years. You know, that's still point, still point, still point, and that generated the healing dynamic. And about 20 years ago, what emerged in the literature was, number one, that the induction of a CV4 in that compressive cycle could be too much because of the nature of traumatic stress that more and more people were showing up with in clinical practice. Okay. See, 20 years ago, it was traumatic stress. Now it's metabolic syndrome. You have to understand the whole evolution of the biology of the contemporary client and how that's evolved. So the EV4, sensing a still point during the expansion phase of the, whatever it is, the cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid body, whatever metaphor it is for that which is expanding, became the treatment du jour, because rather than compressing, which could be triggering for someone holding a lot of stress in their core, in the center of their body, it was much safer to do an EV4, which was typically done from the temporal bone. But then it's like, well, wait a minute, let's let the system decide. Let's just wait, because the system, a still point is like the intrinsic ignition, transition, settling, maintaining, of homeostasis. It's what creates balance in the system. Your system has to periodically stop to recalibrate. So we're just following it, we're just observing that. So in that observation, it can happen now on the compressive phase or the narrowing phase, or it can happen on the expansion phase, or anywhere in between. So it's very beautiful just watching, the evolution of that. In terms of, the evolution, so we went from CV4 to EV4 to let the system self-adjust, as we observe that in terms of whatever phase it wants to self-adjust in, whether that's compressive, expansive, or in between. And now the evolution of thinking about still point is exactly what we've been doing here, is to orient to the stillness out here first, not in here. So that's why we sit, we settle, and in the initial phases of making contact, I kept saying yesterday, now place your attention out here, now place your attention out here. Because there's going to be a way in which the clarity of stillness in the still point can originate out here first, in the environment. And in the osteopathic and the biodynamic osteopathic world, as you know, and as I said in the first day, the natural world, Jealous introduced the natural world as part of the therapeutic intention of this work. Sometimes you're with a client where you've got to take your attention way out into never mind what he calls it. You've got to take your attention way out into the natural world. There are some clients that are so compromised that you have to begin with just letting your attention go out to the tree line or the sky or the clouds or the light or whatever it is, or the bird song, and just wait and wait and wait until your attention spontaneously moves in and that client's body invites you. There's an invitation to come closer to your hands. So, and that's the beauty of biodynamic work. That still point now can extend from the center of the fourth ventricle to anywhere in the body to all the way out to Pluto, or I guess there's a new planet they just discovered last week, all the way out to that new planet.
You have a new planet?
Yeah, there's a new planet. But so there's the logic. And you had a first-hand experience, of that.
That was a real education.
Right. And, we're working on the occiput with the intention that this is a class on traumatic brain injury and concussions. And you may run into people where you can't get anywhere near that occiput, okay? So I'd like to, by way of this practice, just do a little bit of a review of our attitude and physical demeanor when we're doing this practice. We always start with a body scan. The intention of the body scan is to get a sense of the whole shape of the body. So we begin immediately relating to to the wholeness of our body, starting at the feet, noticing any sensation or differences between your right leg and your left leg. A sense of your pelvis. And today, a sense internally of your pelvis, of the pelvic floor, responding to your breath, the pelvic floor able to settle so that your pelvis has more contact with the chair. The trunk of your body dominated by the movement of the respiratory diaphragm and the movement of your heart. And that's a really good piece. I mentioned yesterday in the practice, if you can sit there and observe the movement of your diaphragm and the movement of your heart at the same time, it's a much larger holistic response in your whole body. And that movement of your diaphragm as it goes up and down, taking the heart with it. In a way, your diaphragm is massaging your heart with every breath. Every breath is different, every heartbeat is different. The heart, the diaphragm constantly tuning to the metabolic demands of the body, moment by moment, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. Every heartbeat is different. Every breath is different. And it turns out that that difference that every heartbeat is different and every breath is different is a marker of our overall health and well-being. So the heart is an expert in diversity, constantly changing to meet the metabolic demands of oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. The movement of the heart, when we're consciously aware of it, begins to slowly and subtly shift our brain towards a less fearful, less anxious place. To a place of resilience. We then attempted to sense the connection that our hearts have with each other when we're this close to one another. and that there's a tidal movement that moves through that field all around us and between us. And I suggested yesterday that you could tune into the sternum, the front of your heart, as if it were being very gently pulled or pushed, very subtly in this strong field that's being created by the heart. So we're maintaining attention on our whole body, whole shape, a little bit of attention. We're maintaining a little bit of attention on our breath, the fullness of our breath, the movement of the heart, and the interconnectedness of our hearts, such that there's a very gentle tractioning, pulling, suctioning of the sternum, the pericardium, towards the other. And then a shift, a change in which our sternum, our heart recedes back. And as we tune into this field activity, we can also tune in to this area of stillness around our body, the room itself, the space. Even with the clock ticking and the sound of the traffic, there's a clarity in the stillness of the space that increases the more we put attention on our heart, our aorta, our subclavian veins and arteries, the carotid arteries, the descending aorta, the abdominal aorta, the iliac arteries that go from your abdominal artery down to your leg under the inguinal ligaments. Those arteries changing names to the femoral arteries, deep within the adductors. So each time we practice this, we can do it on our own as a way to sense the wholeness of our body, the movement of the heart, filling the entire space of the trunk and our body. And this is our reference point when we make contact with our client. This movement, this subtle tidal movement between the two of us, and at the end, it's about the stillness. Areas and zones of stillness inside of our body, and these areas and zones of stillness around our body. All the way out to the stillness of the natural world. And when you find yourself getting distracted by too much thinking, or you've forgotten about the movement of your heart, you forgot about breathing, you simply notice that, and without any judgment or aggressiveness, just gently bring yourself back to the breath, the movement of your heart, as a single, unified dynamic. And finally, we we'll bring our attention back to simply breathing as we very slowly begin to disengage from this practice and come back into relationship with each other. Opening your eyes when you feel ready.
Okay, everyone. If you made it this far, you can officially call yourself a cranial nerd. Congratulations. Well, that was 2 hours of relatively coherent material for you to chew on. I know we jumped around a bit, but hopefully it wasn't too distracting and you were able to gather up some good stuff. Please let me know if you like this kind of episode, because we can do more like this if you found it useful. Send me a SpeakPipe message from the homepage or an email at ryan@craniosacralpodcast.com. I'll put a summary of the protocol in the show notes for you to browse over. It's just a small taste of class, but it will give you an idea of where the physical contacts were made at least. Michael will be teaching this class again at Cortiva this year, so I'll put a link to the school site in the show notes as well, and you can go check it out in person if you like. Well, thanks for holding on for a long episode today, guys and gals. I hope things are going well for all of you, and I'll catch you next time.